Okay, good afternoon. Continuing in the book of Bamidbar. This week, outside of Israel, we're going to read two portions. One is called Chukas and the other one is called Balak. The majority of this shir is going to be about the Parshat called Chukas. Where we were last week was the Parsha where we read about the rebellion of Korach and how the earth swallowed him up and his followers, and we talked about that last week. We are now, chronologically, 38 years later. We're at the point where the Jewish people are about to enter the land of Israel. So they have been in the desert for now altogether 40 years, and they're on the cusp of going in to the land of Israel. So everything's going to change for them, right? What they've had now is all of their physical needs taken care of. They've had the food from heaven and the water from the rock and the clouds of glory surrounding them, protecting them, and we've had the fire leading them, so on. Miracles, very miraculous, very spiritual, very connected to God experience that they had while they were traveling in the Midbar, in the desert, with the Mishkan, with the tabernacle as the center of their lives, and they're all camped around it. When they get up, they move, so on. So what happens in this week's Torah portion? This week's Torah portion is called Chukas, and we learn at the beginning a law that was taught years ago, and it's the law of the red heifer. So it's a very complicated law, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, but essentially, as we spoke before in the book of Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus, we talked about the spiritual state that a person comes into when they are in contact with death. So when you are in contact with death, you become tameh. It's a spiritual state that prevents you from entering into the Mishkan. So you become ritually impure, although I don't like the word impure, but you become tameh. And in order to become tahor, in order to become pure, so you can enter into the Mishkan, there is the law of the red heifer. The red heifer was a 1-year-old calf, C-A-L-F, calf, that was purely red in color. There was no hair on its body that was not red, and there was a certain ritual that went through where this red heifer was shechted, was killed, and then it was burnt, and its ashes were mixed with water, and so on and so on. There was a whole thing that we read about in this week's Torah portion, and what that would do would be to transform a person who is tameh into a person who would be then tahor, would be then quote unquote ritually pure and able. So that's what we have with the law of the red heifer. Now, this is a completely obscure law. It's not one that we can we will never ever fathom in this world. And it's given as an example of a law that is considered a chok. So the beginning of this week's Torah portion, I'll read it to you. God says to Moshe and Aaron, this is the basic statute. A chok, a law that we don't have any understanding for. We don't understand why we're doing it, and we do it because God says so. And this is the mechanism. If you want to transform a person from a person who's tahor to a person who's tameh to a person who's tahor, you do this. Same what we learned before about the Mishkan. If you want to build a tabernacle that's going to be a place where God will reside, where His presence will fill, you have to follow the specifications of what God tells you how to build it. If you build it your way, the way you want to build it, with the curtains over here and this over there and the menorah over there, like do it the way you think, it's not going to work. Like if you build a spaceship that does however your whim is, it's not going to take off, right? There are certain laws, there are certain ways in which God says this is how you build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and my presence will dwell there. If you want to be purified from being in contact with death, this is how you do it. You take the red heifer and you shech the red heifer and you burn it up and you take the ashes, etc., etc. So we don't really understand that. We don't understand it at all. In fact, King Solomon, the wisest of all men, was unable to understand the law of the red heifer. It was actually something apparently that Moses, our teacher, that he understood, but he didn't tell us the reason. And I think it's interesting. I read something about, like we enjoy eating. Most of us enjoy eating. And we need to eat. We need to eat to sustain ourselves, to keep ourselves alive. And the food that we eat, we normally enjoy. We choose food that is good for us. And we also choose food that we like the taste of. So built in to our need to eat is a nice taste. We have a nice taste to what we eat, and so we eat. So sometimes you could say, well, I'm eating because I like the taste, or I'm eating because I have to eat, and by the way, I also like the taste, but I'm eating because I have to. And similarly, you could say that if I have a reason for a mitzvah, if I understand, well, I'm doing this because it's a good thing to do, or I'm doing this because and you come up with a reason, like I'm visiting the sick because I if I'm sick, I want someone to visit me, let's say. I mean, that could be a reason, maybe. So then you've built into your system why you think that you're doing something which can replace God tells you to do it. Right? So if I'm doing, keeping kosher because I believe it's cleaner or healthier not to eat shellfish, and then we find very clean shellfish, you say, well, the reason's not there anymore, so I can eat the shellfish. But the Torah isn't like that. The Torah is, these are the laws, and you abide by them and you don't abide by them, and along the way there are reasons why we do them, and they make sense to us and they help us along the way, but it's not the core. The core is because God says so. The example I heard recently in a class was a little child. When you take a child who's trained in eating kosher food, and you go to the supermarket, and as you're checking out, right, there's all these candies lined up, and the child says, can I have a candy? And you go, no, I don't have any money. And the child keeps crying, and you say, well, it's really not good for you. And the child keeps crying. Like, they don't take that as an answer why they can't have the candy. And you say, well, it's really before dinner, and it's not a good time to be eating candy. Again, they're going to keep crying. But for a child that you've trained in keeping kosher, if you say to the child, I would love to give it to you, but it's not kosher, the child stops crying. And this is the truth. This is the way it is. That if you tell a child who's trained that they can't eat kosher food, at the point where you say it's not kosher, they go, okay, fine. They'll go cry about something else. But it's sort of a showstopper. It stops the conversation. And not that we shouldn't have reasons for the mitzvahs that we do, and that we find meaning in them, and that they taste good to us, that we enjoy doing them because we find great pleasure in doing certain things, for sure. But the red heifer and many of the other chukim, the ones that have no reason, we're doing them purely because God says so. Purely because God said so. And red heifer, the law of the red heifer is used as the paradigm for a mitzvah that we do that has no reason. As is wearing a garment that's a mixture of wool and linen. That's also a garment we're not allowed to wear. Why? We don't know, because God says so. And there's some others. But the red heifer is given as an example, the supreme example of a mitzvah that's given of how to transform the ritual state of a person from a state where they can't go into the Mishkan, into the tabernacle, to a state where they can, transforms them. How? Through the mitzvah of the red heifer. We don't know how that works, but it does. So that's, so in there is something, well, God says so that this is what you have to do. So here, what it is it's a chok that teaches us how to transform a person who has come into contact with death. And death is something that permeates through this particular Torah portion. We have the death of Miriam in this week's Torah portion. Miriam, our prophetess. Miriam, the woman, the sister of Aaron and Moses, who argues with her parents and says, parents, if you separate because of the decree of Pharaoh in Egypt, there will be no future. So you have to come back together as husband and wife, and you have to have more children. And because of her arguing with her parents, they come back together and they give birth to Moses and to Aaron. And Moses is hid in a little basket in the Nile, if you remember, and Miriam watches over him. She is his big sister, loves him, watches over him, takes care of him, helps him, and becomes the female energy, the force of the feminine in the desert as we're traveling through the desert. Miriam, along with her brothers Aaron and Moshe, who are leaders of the children of Israel as they're going through the desert. So Miriam dies in this week's Torah portion, and also Aaron dies in this week's Torah portion, and we have a decree that God gives to Moses that he's going to die out in the desert and he's not going to enter into the land. Into the land of Israel. So we learn about the deaths of Moses and death of Aaron and Miriam, and the impending death of Moses. So death is something that permeates through this Torah portion. So I want to pick up the story at the point where Miriam dies, and it's very powerful that we learn in our oral tradition that Miriam and Aaron and Moses die by the kiss of God. The kiss of God. It's a death, one of the deaths. It says in the Gemara, in our oral tradition, there are 903 types of death, one of which is a kiss. and the holiest people get kissed. So what does that mean? So let's go back to the Garden of Eden. Let's go back when Adam and Eve were first created. And they're in the garden, and we learn from the mystical tradition that their soul was a very pure, very holy, very shiny, very prominent part of who they were. They had a wisp of body, but mostly they were soul. And when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, when they ate from that tree, things changed. What happened was that their body became much more physical. The physical aspects of who we are as people became much more solid, hidden. We hide our soul inside of us, and the soul went in. So we have what we have today, our body with the soul. The soul's inside. The body is what's more prominent. The body is what you see. And in that state, they were banished from the Garden of Eden. They went out into the world, and that's who we are. We're a mixture of body and soul, just like Adam and Eve, but our soul is hidden inside. The soul comes from God, from the breath of God. We are a divine. We have a B'Tselem Elokim. We have an image of God, because there's a breath of God that's being blown into us. Our soul comes from the divine, comes from God. And our body comes from the ground, comes from the dust and earth. And we read about this in the book of Genesis, where our body is made from the earth. And in order to rectify what happened, God built into the universe death. So at the day that they ate from that tree of knowledge of good and evil, the consequence was that death comes into the world, because death is a necessary part of bringing us back to the wholeness that Adam and Eve had before they ate from that tree. What does that mean? It means that the soul is in contact with God always. There's always this divine light that's coming and that's showering into us from God, through our souls, through our noses, through our neshama, through the divine light that sheds into us, and into this vessel that's the body that comes from the ground. So Moses and Aaron and Miriam had lived their whole lives striving and yearning and creating a relationship with God. They were very, very aware and concentrated on their spiritual lives, on their soul's relationship to God and the mission that they had in this world. And so when God imbued a bit more spirituality into them, their souls couldn't be contained in their physicality anymore, because they were not attached to their physicality. They were searching and yearning for the divine. The divine comes and kisses them, and their soul is lifted gently out of their bodies, like it says in the Gemara, like pulling a hair out of a vat of milk. So if you pull a hair out of milk, it smoothly comes out to a smooth extraction of the hair from the milk, a smooth extraction of the soul from the body, going back into the world of souls. What happens to the body? The body goes into the ground, the dust from where it came. From dust you came, from dust you will return. And the body goes back into the ground in order for God to purify our bodies, so that at the end of days there will be a reunification of that soul and that purified body that is now not so opaque. Now it's a spiritual entity able to absorb the spirituality of the soul and raise it up to an infinite level, to an eternal level where it will exist like that for eternity. So we are on a journey. As much as we think this is it, this is now, this is the only reality, this is all we know, and everything we can explain is what it is, this Torah portion is telling us there's a lot we don't understand. There's so much that we don't understand. What do we know? We're looking through a keyhole, a little tiny keyhole, and we're in a chapter book where we're right in the where we are. We're in the end of the chapter. We're at the five, close to the 6,000th year. We're almost at the end of this reality. We're in a book, and we're still reading that book, but we don't know the whole picture. We only know a little bit. But we do look into the Torah and we find the wisdom that's there, and we say, how do we apply this to our lives? How do we understand that we're going to learn about a chok, we're going to learn about a law, we have no idea how it works and what it does, and we can't apply it today, but we need to learn about it, because we need to learn that at the end of the day, everything's a chok. Everything's outside of our realm of understanding. We're given reasons and understandings, like do this and you'll feel good, or, honor your parents or your lives will be long, etc., etc. They're giving us tasty flavors, so that we continue to eat, so that we continue to do the right things, to continue to put the needle in the acupuncture point so that the chi will flow. In order to bring the flow in, we have to do certain things. We matter, our lives matter, what we do matter. But we're held accountable. Like we have a reason why we're here. We don't go the way of other animals in the world and just die and be done. We die and we continue on. Our souls and our bodies continue on, even though they're not in the coupling of body and soul that they are right now, right this second. But the soul continues on. The body has to go through its purification, and then there is a reunification of the two. So the soul comes from God, and the body comes from the ground, from the dust of the earth, and it's stimulated by physicality, and our soul is stimulated by spirituality, by transcendence, by seeking something, like the fly in the bottle, looking up, trying to find a way out, trying to find where the sun's coming from, trying to find where the light's coming from, trying to find why I'm in this bottle in the first place, how to get out of this bottle the best way possible. That's the dichotomy. That's the paradox. That's the difficulty of body and soul connection, which we spend our lives struggling to focus in on the spiritual. Focus in on the spiritual. Bring your physicality along. Don't leave the physical behind. Use your body to visit the sick. Use your body to pick up the phone and call somebody in need. Use your body to attend to the dead. We're using our bodies as vessels, as vehicles to live our lives according to the Torah values. That's the point of the body, so that the soul can reach higher realms and bring spirituality and light and love and goodness into the world. We're an amazing coupling of divinity and spirituality with physicality, and we have the capacity to infuse our material beings with spirituality. We can't do it all the way. In fact, it says in our tradition that there were a few people, including Elijah the prophet, who were able to completely spiritualize their body, such that it says that they didn't die. Their whole body and soul went up together into the higher realms. But for all of us, including Miriam and Aaron and Moses, they die the way of all men, with the soul leaving its body. So they died by a kiss of God. God comes and increases a little spirituality, a little bit of spirituality into their being, and their soul is so craving to be part of that divinity that it leaves, and it's not wedded to its body. It's not stuck. It's like pulling that hair out of the milk. It just comes out. It's just ready to go. It's been waiting to be reunited with divine its whole life. It's not been, they call it like a shotgun wedding. A shotgun wedding. You put these two things together. You put the body and the soul together. How do they become like a couple that's intertwined, and it's hard to take one out from the other? Or we use the body, but really we're focused on the spiritual, like Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And so when God increases the spirituality of sheds a little bit more light and love and divine energy into them, their soul's ready to leave. It's ready. It's going. People who die in their sleep, people who've achieved a high spiritual level, and we're not to judge who is and who isn't. It says that their soul leaves like that. People who are very enmeshed in their physicality, and the whole world's about physicality, and they're not thinking spiritual things, they're not doing spiritual things. And again, not judging, but this is sort of like the tradition, this is the teaching. Then their death is like taking a cotton out of a thorn bush. Like it's enmeshed, it's hard to pull it out, it's not ready, it doesn't want to leave. And there is an aspect that we don't want to leave, where we're hopefully we enjoy this world, and we're enjoying being here, and we want more opportunities to increase light and love and goodness into the world. We want to do that. So when we read about death, when we read about the para aduma, the red heifer, and we read about this as something we don't understand, but yet there is a process where we can take a person from a state of tameh, where they've been in contact with the dead, and we can elevate them to a state of tahor. This is how you do it. Just do it because God says this is how you do it. Fine. I might not understand it, but I'm going to do it because I understand God knows more than I do, right? So we're going to minimize our sense that I know and God knows, and then we'll do it. So here we have Miriam who dies. So let's read a little bit inside about Miriam dying, and then what happens in the aftermath of her death. Okay, so Miriam dies in Kadesh. and she was buried there. And there was no water for the community, and they assembled against Moses and Aaron. The people contended with Moshe, and they said, "Would we have perished when our brothers perished before God? Why did you bring the community of God into the wilderness, that we and our animals would die there? For what purpose have you brought us up from Egypt in order to bring us to this evil place? This is not a place of seed or of figs or of wine or of pomegranates. There is not even water to drink." So we have the complaining, we have the people complaining. But what's the juxtaposition? The juxtaposition is Miriam dies and now there's no water. So in every source we learn that Miriam was able, through her spiritual level, to bring water into this world, to bring out water for the people, to feed the people with water, to give them water, to quench their thirst, metaphorical and physical. Physical thirst, they're thirsty, they need to drink, they're in the desert, but also like their spiritual thirst, their thirst, they're learning, they're growing, they're surging, they're passionate, right? Then Miriam was giving them this water, and it was coming down in her merit because of the high level of spirituality that she has achieved. She's achieved a capacity through her spiritual energy in the world to open up that portal, whatever this means, and bring water out of a rock. Okay, so we don't really understand it, but we do understand that in her merit, water was abundant for the people in the desert until she died. And when she died, there was no more water. So what's fascinating is there's a medrash that teaches about Miriam singing to the rock, that she would sing to the rock, and in her song would come forth the water. And she taught this song to all the tribal heads, and they would also sing. And it was also interesting that the rock, when the water would come out, it would separate into 12 different tributaries. So each tribe would receive their water specifically coming to them. It wasn't like they all had to come and fill up at the well. It was like the water flowed towards them. There's great metaphors of ideas of water and Torah and knowledge and being sustained by this, and it's coming from inside the rock, it's coming out of the rock to sustain us. Like we have this water inside of us that's sustaining us, that's animating us, and in the merit of Miriam, this water was coming out of the rock, and we were nourished and we were sustained by this water. So when she dies, the water dries up. And what's interesting is there was nothing left over. It wasn't like they had a bit from yesterday. It was like there was nothing left over. So I heard something very interesting. Some of you may know that if you're ever with somebody when they pass away, when they die, that if there's any water around in the room, you should spill out the water. So we don't really understand why. There's a couple of reasons given, one of which is that the Malach Amaves, the angel of death, right? So the messenger who comes to take the lives of people, that so to speak, he washes his sword in the water. So we spill out the water because God forbid we should drink from that water. So that's kind of a mystical idea. I don't really understand it, but it's one of them. And the other idea, the other reason why we spill out the water is because when Miriam died, there was no water left. So we kind of back up and say, well, the people in the desert must have spilled out their water in the presence of the death of Miriam, that they spilled out their water. So it was being done in the days of the desert, we were spilling out this water. So I just want to mention something about the Malach HaMaves, about this angel of death, where I spoke before about God increasing spirituality into the people that he kisses and they die, like the kiss of death, right? We have that phrase in our modern culture, in our modern culture, the kiss of death. But it comes from God kissing people, and by infusing a little bit more spirituality, such that their souls attracted to that spirituality and leave. The opposite is, or the other ways of dying is with the Malach HaMaves. What is that? So the Malach HaMaves, the angel of death. So an angel, we understand, is a messenger, and it comes with a job, and the job of the Malach HaMaves is to take the souls of people when it's time for them to die. So how do they do that? And I read this, I never learned this before, is by increasing the physicality of the person, increasing the tame nature of a person. So as we become more and more and more and more tame, more and more physical, more and more mired in this world, then our soul can't live here anymore and our soul leaves. So one way is by increasing the spirituality. The holy souls of the righteous leave by that kiss, versus the rest of us, where our body becomes so physical, so tame, that the soul can't stand to live there. It's too much physicality for the soul, and the soul has to leave. So kind of like another interesting way. Just another sidebar comment, that if you remember when we talked about the spies and how the spies, they went into the land of Israel to spy out the land, and they came back with the report, and it was an evil report, and it was a report about how the people were going to eat them up, and it was impossible for the Jewish people to go into the land. How would they be able to go into the land? And the people they cried that night, and God says, all right, you can't go in, you guys have to die out in the desert, and it will be the next generation that will go into the land. So apparently every year, says our Medrash, every year on Tisha B'Av, which was the night that the spies came back and gave the evil report, and the people cried that night, every year on that night, the whole assembly would dig themselves a grave. They would sit in their grave. They would say goodbye to everybody. They would sit in their grave, and they would lie in the grave all night. And if it was their time, they would die in their graves. And if they didn't, they would get up. But like, what a way to live every year, knowing that there's this potential, or like at that moment where you get into the grave that you dug for yourself and said, like, I don't know if I'm going to wake up in the morning. I don't know if this is my time. And the awareness of death that the people in the Midbar, the people in the desert had. And I think in our society we do a disservice because we don't talk about death enough. And death is a great motivator for living our lives so powerfully. If we really understood this on a deep level, none of us are going to escape this world without dying, right? This is what's going to happen to all of us unless the Messiah comes. And if without that being the case, the likelihood is that we will die, right? So let's live our lives fully. Let's understand why we're here. Let's listen to more classes. Let's try to understand. Let our soul lead our journey through this world. Let the soul be the one that's in the driving seat of our physicality. So yes, it may be uncomfortable, and maybe there's not enough stimulation for your body because your body wants to eat this or do that or that. But your soul, if you put your soul in the driving seat, we're going to go in the right direction. So anyway, that's the plug there. So Miriam dies, and in her merit the water dries up. The water was only coming forth because of her and her song and her ability to bring water from this rock. So now what? The people are complaining, and they go to Moses and Aaron, they complain to Moses and Aaron don't know what to do, and they go to God and they say, what are we going to do? And God says, take the staff. Remember we had this, Moses has a staff, and assemble the community, you and your brother Aaron, and speak to the rock before their eyes, and give forth its water, and then you will bring forth water to them from out of the rock, and you will give the community and the animals to drink. So God says, take the staff, go to the rock, and speak to the rock, and the people will see the water coming out of the rock from you speaking to the rock. And Moses took the staff that he had laid before God as he had commanded him, and Moshe and Aaron assembled the community before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, and he's faulted for saying you rebels, shall we bring forth water from out of this rock? And Moses raised his hand, and he struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came forth abundantly, and the community and the animals drank. And God says to Moses and Aaron, because you did not hold fast to me, to sanctify me before the eyes of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this community into the land that I have given them. God told Moses and Aaron to speak to the rock. Moses and Aaron hit the rock, and for that Moses gets to not take the people into the land of Israel. So a few things. One is, and a few different explanations. There's a lot of commentary about what the punishment was for Moses, that he couldn't go in because he hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock. What was going on here? And there's a few things, and I'll bring out a few of them. One is that when he says speak to the rock, but he hit the rock. The speaking is a much gentler form of communicating than hitting. And Moses has carried these people from a really long time, from the time when they were in Egypt, where he defends them and he advocates for them, and he's the messenger of God, and he goes to Pharaoh and he brings the people, and he's bringing the plagues, and he's splitting the sea, and we come out and we're in the desert, and we're wandering in the desert for 40 years. He's carried this people, and we're going from overt miracles to a reality where we're going to have to work the land, where we're going to be physical, where we're going to have waste, where we're not going to be in the clouds of glory with water coming out of a rock and food from heaven. It's going to be a physical reality. And the shifting and the changing, when we go from being an infant that needs to be taught perhaps with strictness and with harshness and with the rod, we transition to a people about to enter the land who need to be spoken to. We need to be encouraged. We need to be persuaded, perhaps. We need a different form of communication than the rod. God says, don't use the rod. God says, take the staff and speak to the rock. And he doesn't speak to the rock. He hasn't transitioned as a leader. He's a leader that can't lead this generation into the promised land. This generation needs people who will speak to them. They need a leader who will not call them rebels. Maybe they were rebels back then, right? This is a different generation. This is a generation after the generation of Egypt that died out. This is a generation that's perhaps learned the lessons from their parents about what happened and taken on the traditions that their parents have given them. But they like, what eyes are their leaders seeing them with? Are the leaders seeing the people as rebels? If I see my children as rebels, I'm going to treat them a certain way. If I see them as people and I understand why they're acting this way, and I'm more forgiving of them, and I love them, and I want to carry them, and I'm not going to call them rebels. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to try to cajole them and speak to them and help them and bring out the water that's from within them by speaking, not by hitting them. Okay, maybe you hit if the child runs into the road and it's really dangerous, and you're going to hit a little child. You're not going to hit an adult child. Right? So now we have a generation that's poised, ready to go into the land of Israel. And Moses is hitting them, so to speak. Like, his modus operandus is to hit the rock. He's still hitting the rock. 40 years ago, he hit the rock to bring the water out, and he's hitting the rock again. And he hasn't transitioned, says some of our commentators, into a leader who's going to speak and cajole and persuade with words. And again, the power of words, how powerful are our words, what we create with our words, the relationships we create with our words. And really, like, I feel like I'm speaking to myself as I say this, like how important it is in our relationships with people and people that we mentor, etc., that to use our words really carefully and to see the people in our midst with loving eyes, really with loving eyes. So this is a lesson number one. Number one is Moses perhaps didn't get to go into the land, say some of our commentators, because he hadn't transitioned as a leader. He couldn't lead this generation. This next generation that's going to go in, need a leader who's going to talk to them, not hit them. Need a generation that's not going to see them as rebels, not going to take a narrative of what they used to be like and hold on to it. Like, let them change, let them be different people, let them be a new generation that's going to learn a new lesson and help them with a new lesson. Don't label them with the sticker of what their parents were, right? So maybe they are asking, maybe it's an innocuous asking, maybe they're not so complaining, maybe they just don't understand, and their bodies are craving water and they need water. But what are they craving? Are we craving water, sustenance, physical water for our bodies? Are we craving spiritual sustenance, the water of the Torah, the water that's going to come out of the rock through speech, not through ramming it down our throats? Good lesson for us to learn. Like if I want to, I it's interesting, I had a conversation with someone recently about, like, we want to be able to think for ourselves, don't we? Isn't that a value that we have, that it's important to think for ourselves and to own our own lives and to own our own decisions? And this person was saying, no, that isn't always a value that everybody has. Some people just want the people around them to do the walk and talk the talk, but it doesn't matter what you feel on the inside. So I really disagree with that. I think it's important that we have the whole package, that we walk and talk and think and process and live all all in complicity with each other, that we're all like a one package. You know, when it's not, the outside looks different than what's on the inside. It's the same. It's the inside outside. Okay, so the other reason given in many of the commentators as to why Moses doesn't get to go into the land is because he was angry. He got angry with the people and he hit the rock out of anger. And again, run away from anger. Anger is considered the most egregious character trait to have. Like, if you feel angry, says our commentators, it's an affront to God. It's saying God hasn't run the world properly because you're angry at it. Like, it's not going your way. You don't like what you see, then you're not really a believing person. You shouldn't get angry. Like, anger somehow is mixed in there with idolatry. But however you see anger, flee from anger, because when you're angry, you can't think straight. When you're angry, you can't say the right words. When you're angry, you're clouded. Your vision is clouded. So run away from anger. Don't be angry. And how is it that Moses was angry with the people? Like, and that for that he's faulted. So we don't really know all the reasons. And maybe it goes back to the whole idea of the chok, the red heifer. We have no idea, you know, and we have some explanations as to why Moses doesn't get to go into the land, but we really, at the end of the day, don't know. He doesn't get to go into the land, and it's given, a reason is given, because he hit the rock and he didn't speak to the rock. Okay, so we also learn in this week's Torah portion about the death of Aaron. So Aaron also dies in this week's Torah portion, and in his merit are the clouds of glory. The clouds of glory that surround the Jewish people are because of his high level of spiritual attainment. When he dies, that protection disappears. And what happens is that the people start to get bitten by snakes. And the snakes were there all along, but we were protected from the bites of the snakes by the clouds. And when the clouds disappeared, then the people, I don't think I can find it inside, the people are now susceptible to the bites of the snakes. Interesting. If you so yesterday I was pushing a stroller with a baby, and I was actually literally dragging it across some rocks. So I'm pulling, and the baby's looking the opposite direction, and I'm pulling the other way, right? So we get across the rocks, and then I come around and I look at the baby, and there was a sense that I had at that moment where the baby had no idea that I was dragging obviously this baby, but the idea is that if you're looking that way, you don't see what's happening behind you. The story of the boy who's riding on his father's shoulders, and he's looking up. He says, "Daddy, where are you? Where are you?" And he's looking all around up there. And the father says, "Look down, my son. You know, I'm carrying you." The metaphor for God carrying us. The clouds that protected us, we didn't understand what they were doing. We didn't understand how much protection we were getting from them until they disappeared. When the clouds disappeared, then the snakes could bite us. And the snakes were there all along. But we didn't know it because we were protected. But we don't know we're being protected till we're not protected. Right? So too, the people in the desert, so too us. We don't recognize what didn't happen because it didn't happen, right? The near misses that we didn't have, or the illnesses that we didn't get, or the car accidents we didn't get into, or the et cetera, you name it. The things that didn't happen, we can't be grateful for because it didn't happen, so we don't know. But the message is that there's a protection, there's a protective cloud that surrounds us, and were that to disappear, then we would really be in trouble. There would be a different level of existence for us. And so just as much as this story teaches us about the clouds protecting the Jewish people, and when the clouds disappear, the snakes start to bite, so too we should perhaps think a little bit about how sheltered we are and how much God is holding us and blessing us, and we don't recognize it because we're too busy looking in the other direction, or we're too busy thinking it's because of our own powers that things are happening to us, or we're averting things, or we invested in this and it did really well, but that's because of me, or I didn't invest over there, like whatever, I don't know, whatever scenario you want to conjure up. But the notion, just a notion to think about, which is how much God protects us and helps us without us even knowing it. And this is a story about that. So what the cure to the snakes. So the people complain about the snakes, and I would actually like to find it inside, because it's really nice to read it. Here. So, and God sent the venomous snakes against the people. They bit the people, and many people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned because you have spoken against God and against you. Pray to God that he may turn away the snakes from us." And Moses prayed for the people, and God said to Moses, "Make yourself a venomous snake and place it upon a tall pole. And it shall come to pass that anyone who is bitten, let him look upon it, and he will live." And Moshe made a copper snake, and he placed it upon the tall pole. And it came to pass that if a snake had bitten a man, he would look upon the copper snake and live. Crazy. So you know that healing medical symbol of a pole with a snake wound around it? It's from this week's Torah portion. So the people are being bitten by a snake. The snake represents the Yetzer Hara. The snake, remember, go back to the Garden of Eden. The snake is the energy, the force that tried to persuade, and did persuade Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It was the force to kind of like push you away, to push you to do something you shouldn't do. That force, that negative energy is represented by the snake. So what happens to the snake? The snake's consequence for having the role of getting Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is to slide on the ground, to not have, like, always have food around, never need to pray to God. God said, "I'm done with you, go away." Like, have no sense of God in its life. Like it's just slithering on the ground. And there's actually a couple of things about snakes. One is apparently they copulate when they're pregnant, meaning that there's a sense of pleasure that this is the only animal in the whole animal kingdom, I don't know if that's correct, but I don't know, it sounds good, that has intercourse for pleasure other than humans. I don't know if that's true, but I heard it. And also that it bites without being attacked, without being provoked. So a snake you could be sitting somewhere and a snake will come out and attack you even if it doesn't feel threatened. So there's that aspect of a snake. So the snakes, they come and they start biting the Jewish people, and the people complain, and they go to Moses and Aaron, they say, "Pray for us," and they pray to God to take away. And God says, "Take the snake and put it up on a pole, and anytime somebody gets bitten, look at that snake, look at the snake." So I think I read somewhere, I don't remember where, what you're doing is you're facing your enemies. You're facing that part of you that's going to lead you astray, that part of you that needs to be worked on, that part of you that you hide away, that part of you that you don't want to look at, the part of you that's holding you back, the part of you that won't let you be your full self because you feel embarrassed or ashamed or jealous or angry or whatever it is. It's in there and it's part of you, and unless you take it out and look at it, it won't go away. What an amazing imagery it is for God to say, put that snake, the epitome of the energies that take you away from spirituality and holiness, take it and put it in front of your eyes and look at it. But don't look down at it. Look up at it. Look up at it, because it's something you have to face. It's something you have to look at and see and overcome, and then keep looking beyond it up into the heavens, because that's where your strength comes from. So in the act of looking up at the snake, you're looking at your enemies, and you're also recognizing that it's all from God. So again, we have this idea of it's all from God, like the protection that we have, and the derech, and the path that we're on, and our skill set that we have is gifts from God, and you have to put a certain amount of work in. So put your work in, look at the snake, face the snake head on, like don't take your eyes off it, like keep processing it, and then it'll create a healing in you, and you'll recognize that came from God, that leap beyond your own capacities is a gift from God. So that's kind of like that imagery of us looking at the enemy, so to speak, looking at those parts of us that we are embarrassed about or ashamed of or don't know how to deal with, or the anger parts of us, like take it out and look at it, the traumas, like whatever it is that you feel holds you back, like the parts of the angers and the broiguses that you have with other people, etc. Like take them out and look at them and face them and talk about them. Maybe, I don't know, like it's hard, or go to therapy, I don't know, the idea is to process them. Don't push them away. The more you push them away, the more they'll hold you back and hold you down. So in order to be the fullest you can be, you have to look at those things that you hide, and the things that hide, like the snake. Like the snake's coming up behind you and it's biting you, and you need help, and you pray to God, and God says, look at it, and I'll help you heal. And so the healing comes from looking at the snake, facing it, and then God will heal you, and he does. He heals the people. So it's a really amazing way to look at it all. Okay, so that's the idea of the snakes. And so that's really the Parshat. And there's other things that they're traveling through different lands on their way to Israel. They conquer one land. They don't go into another land. God says, don't go into the land of the Ammonites. Why? Just don't. I'm telling you, don't go in there. So they don't. They listen to God. They don't understand why. They do it because God says so. Like they're reaching, like these milestones along the way are happening for them to work on themselves, to understand God's really in charge. God's really the one that's leading me. God's really the one that's sustaining me. God's really the one that's making this all happen. And at the end of the day, when our leaders die, and that was another reason why Moses doesn't go into the land of Israel, is because of the capacity to put Moses on such a high pedestal that he would become almost godlike. Like Moses, as holy and as spiritual and as connected to God as he is, he's still a man and he still dies. We don't know where his burial place is, but he still dies. But you Moses might not be able to go into the land, says some of our commentators, is because of the potential for the people to idolize him, for him to become their God. And that's for sure not okay, and don't do that. So we can't have a Moses of such a high spiritual level going into the physical land. Like, it's too physical for Moses to go into that land. He's too spiritual a being. He has to stay in the desert. That's what he's achieved through his lifetime, is such elevation of spirit that he can't exist as a man in the land of Israel. As much as he wants to, and he wants to do the mitzvahs that are in the land of Israel, he can't, because his spiritual achievements have to stay in the desert. All of that, all of those miracles, all of the alertness, all of the womb of being with like in the presence of God all the time is ending, and we're going into Israel. We're going to take the tabernacle with us. We're going to set it up in Shiloh, and then it's going to come the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. But we're on a different spiritual plane than we were back then. So let's full circle back to the idea of death that we spoke about at the beginning and what it's all about. So death, again, is the uncoupling of our body and soul. Our bodies come from the ground, our souls come from the vine. And the soul has the capacity to transform our bodies and make it permeable to the light of spirituality. The role of the soul is to elevate the physical. The role of the soul is to elevate the physical and to make the physical more permeable to the light of spirituality. And the more we do that, the more our extraction of soul from body will be like a shotgun marriage, will be like pulling a hair out of milk. And when it goes on and it goes into this garden of souls where it resides until the end of days and so on, until the body goes back into the ground and has its purification that God will bring about, then we bring them back together. And that's Olam Haba. That's the world to come that we're all like anticipating. This is just the bridge of life. We're only a little bridge going through this bridge of life. Just like the people in the desert were coming out of Mitzrayim, coming out of Egypt, and they were going to go into the land of Israel. That was their journey. We have our journeys, and they last 80 years, perhaps 70 years, 60 years, whatever it is. That's our allotted time to do our work that we have to do, and it matters, and we all matter, and we're all important, and we're all here for a reason. So Moses doesn't get to go into the land because he couldn't. He was too spiritual. He had to stay in the desert. He was too spiritual. He was a leader that didn't become a leader of speech. He didn't become a leader that was able to persuade the people to live there. He was a leader that was more of the like hit the rock kind of a guy, right? And Miriam, who's singing to the rock, bringing the water out through song. How amazing an imagery of that is that. Releasing what's inside through singing. How spiritual and holy and loving were her songs that brought out water from the rock. And Moses doesn't get there. He doesn't get to the place of speaking to the rock. He hits the rock, and for that he doesn't merit to go in. He's not the right leader for the job. He was the right leader up until this point, and now it's time to transition to a different leader. Joshua takes the people into the land. So Miriam, our lovely Miriam, who sings, who looks over her brother, who is intimately intertwined with water. Miriam, her name is water, and the name appears many different times attached to water. She watches over him when Moses is put into the water, and she is the source of water in the desert, and water as a metaphor for wisdom, for life, for Torah, for gushing forth, for surging forward, for bringing out what's on the inside, for being able to help us actualize who we are. Miriam lies in the desert. And another actually interesting reason given as to why it is that Moses hits the rock is because he is so bereft of his loving sister. When she dies, the next thing to do is the people complain. Does he have time? We don't learn anything. I haven't read anything about him mourning his sister. His sister was, he was so attached to his sister, like she really was like a mother to him through all of this journey through the Midbar, through the desert, and she dies. And does he have time to mourn? Do we hear about him mourning? Like, it must be such a loss for him to have lost his beloved sister / caretaker / sibling of joint mission, etc., and he loses her, and perhaps in his mourning he hits the rock, perhaps out of a state of angst, anguish and bereftness he hits the rock. Perhaps that's another more human way to understand what it is that Moses did when he hit the rock instead of speaking to it, that he was so saddened and so upset at his loss of Miriam that he hits the rock. Next week's Torah portion is Pinchas, but this week's Torah portion has two. So we talked mostly about Chukas, and then the second parsha we read about in this week's Torah portion is Balak, and in there is and I will speak about it more next week, is the desire for this king Balak to curse the Jewish people. So he hires a prophet, Bilam, to curse the Jewish people, and the underlying lesson is that he is unable to curse the Jewish people. God won't let him, and as much as out of his mouth comes words of curse, they get transformed into words of blessing. So perhaps we can leave, and I'm not going to, I didn't really research so much about Balak for this week's Torah class, but we'll talk about it next time. But again, the idea that God's in charge, God's running this ship, and whether or not we like it or whether or not we understand it, that there is a captain of the ship, and the captain of the ship is God, and we're heading in a certain direction, and there are certain things that are totally out of our control, but then there's a certain amount of things that are in our control. What's in our control is how we think and how we act and how we talk, and how we understand the universe, and our desire to understand that, and our desire to yearn to know that, and to machinate over it, and to think about it, and to toil in it, and to like really try to understand the limited amounts of things that we can understand. It adds more passion to our lives, and so I guess the bracha that I leave us all with is that we can take the message of knowing that there's death in the world, that death came into the world to enact a purification, just like the death of the holy people, Miriam and Moses and Aaron, when they died. Their legacy, their lessons, what they achieved in this world continues to flow through the generations. So too, what we do sends ripples out into the world, will continue beyond us, beyond our finite existence here. That there's a capacity to understand that there's so much more going on in this world than we know, to understand that death is part of the process, that death is an uncoupling of body and soul. There's different ways to die. Moses and Aaron and Miriam merit to die by the kiss of God, where the soul is extracted by increasing spirituality into them, by shedding more light and love and spirituality into them, such that their souls can't stay in their bodies anymore and have to leave, versus the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death that comes and increases the Tameh, the negative, so materialism aspect of ourselves, such that we sink deeper into materialism, so our souls have to leave because it's too gross an environment for the soul to exist. So that's kind of the other end of it. And the idea of water and what water is, and the water's coming out, and water's nourishing us, and water's feeding us and giving us inspiration and giving us sustenance and literally watering us, so that we will not only survive but thrive. So my bracha to us is that we thrive, that we live our lives fully, that we have a passion for learning, that we have a passion for increasing our spiritual sides of who we are, that we recognize this coupling of body and soul is who we are, and that we use our bodies well, and we use our spirits well, and that we face our enemies head on, we take the snake, put it up, but at the end of the day, whether we lose or not, whether we win or not, it's because of God, that God's the ultimate captain of our ship. So wishing you all a really good week.